Minimalism was the trend of the 2010s, with influencers and designers flocking to the sleek and neutral. But almost 10 years later, and the aesthetics could not be more different. Big, bold, and colorful is in, and minimalism is dead. Say hello to the newest and honestly one of the most frightening trends of our generation, maximalism. Maximalism is truly the most perfect consumer trend. If maximalism means lots of objects, and the whole point of consumer culture is to sell objects, then we have officially arrived at peak consumerism. What other trend can equally convince you to not only buy a bedazzled leopard and crystal chandelier, but also replace everything that you already own with something more colorful and obnoxious that will just fall out of favor and fashion in a couple of years? Now, because of how trends swing back and forth on a cultural pendulum, maximalism is at least partially understood in opposition to its predecessor and opposite, which is minimalism. Now, as you may know if you know me at all, I am a person who participated in the minimalist movement. I've made many videos about the subject over the course of my career here on the platform. We actually made another one about how minimalism was dying on this channel, which works as a nice prequel, so maybe go check that one out too. If you are here for that kind of commentary, you may also enjoy our other videos that we make about the consumer world over on Patreon. There you can get early access to our videos on top of an entirely dedicated podcast where I and the producer of this channel discuss other subjects in further detail exclusively for that audience. So if you're interested in that, check it out through the link down in the description. So when we started doing the research for this video, I honestly kind of dismissed the movement as anything other than just another cash grab by the, powers that be that dictate our cultural trends. But it turns out that this is not maximalism's first appearance in human history. Turns out that maximalism has been around in some form or another since basically people had money to flex on each other with. One could say that the very first maximalists ever were in the Baroque era in 17th century Europe. You'll notice intricate lines, complex visual information, and just straight up bling. And yes, ultimately this fixation on stuff, really elaborate, unnecessary, opulent stuff, is just a marker of class and success. Now remember, this was the era where Europeans were pillaging other countries leading up to the Industrial Revolution, so the thing to do was to show off all of your fancy stuff to your fancy friends that you got from the latest successful mission to whatever distant exotic lands you went to. The colonial mindset of the time would be to show off the chandeliers, the gold leaf furniture, the elaborate wall tapestry, and really big wigs and whatever. But the philosophy behind it was, the more that you have, the more that you are. And listen, if you've watched this channel before, you probably know that I am not a fan of stuff in general, unless it is Victorian era taxidermy hats. And in that case, I mean, it's just obvious that those things are dope and will surely be making a comeback any day now. Right after we're done with Ugg boots, it's gonna be taxidermy hats. Then maximalism came back in the roaring 20s Art Deco era. This time, it was less about showing off your wealth and more a story of having just survived the turmoil and scarcity of World War I. All of a sudden, the economy was booming. Americans could afford to indulge in things that they hadn't had access to for years. And there was this idea that industrial and tech innovations and fancy buildings and statues and stuff would solve all of our world problems. But then, the most recent iteration of the style was in the 60s and the 70s. And this is probably, in my opinion, the coolest version of maximalism as a cultural and artistic trend. It became a lot less about stuff and more about intentionally creating your environment to be a space that made you feel nourished and alive, which on a fundamental level is not really that different from what Marie Kondo and the minimalist trend was saying as well. Some people literally call this era and this aesthetic the aesthetic of joy. But in this case, the joy is sparked from colors, patterns, and textures with big creative expressions meant to evoke big feelings. Yes, this is, of course, when everybody was doing psychedelics, but the point was to be intentionally stimulating, engaging, and nourishing, looking for that joie de vivre that we all desperately seek secretly inside. However, the maximalism trend of today is just a shell of all of its ancestors. We got the ugly carpets of the 70s without the good vibes. We got all of the stuff that we don't need, but with none of the craftsmanship. Now, according to designers like Nick Lewis, who is a friend of the channel, maximalism is about drama and evoking emotions through things like bold colors, dramatic patterns, and layered textures, similar to what it's been in the past. But most of all, it's supposed to be about storytelling and the idea that objects hold stories within them. So yeah, looking back to the Victorian era, they were telling stories about the stuff that they had and how rich they were. But back then, the stuff was likely really well made and built with a certain level of design knowledge. But the modern iteration of maximalism is often not that well thought out and has been appropriately named cluttercore. All right, so zooming out a little bit, I think I have probably said, and a lot of other people have definitely said, that the pandemic was the death of minimalism and the conception of modern maximalism. But our research revealed that the pandemic was just a tipping point for a trend that was already underway. In 2019, the year before Miss Rona gave us an extended timeout in our homes, maximalism was trending in apartment blogs, which, I mean, multiple things there. Minimalist maximalism, don't really understand what's going on there. And apartment blogs? So many new things to take in there. However, even before this, in 2017, Milan Design Week showcased a bunch of pieces that don't look super maximalist to my untrained eye, but apparently have the luxurious materials and layering of shapes that indicated that the style was about to come back. Combine this with the pandemic lockdowns where we were all suddenly stuck in our homes with nothing to do but stare at our sterile ass looking minimalist living rooms. And people very logically started to crave more coziness in their surroundings, more active reminders of joy and the vibrancy of life. We went very quickly from less is more to less is bore. And then some changes were just practical, right? Like you can't go to the gym anymore, buy a set of weights. Minimalism just didn't make sense anymore in the way that it had before the pandemic, but that's not all that happened. In our other video about minimalism, we talk about how minimalism worked very well for the middle class folks who had the time and the resources to consider who they wanted to be, how they wanted to live, and to optimize their lives to match those goals. The cluttercore TikTok generation is really the opposite of that in both style and demographic. These are not privileged people with boundless resources. They're Gen Z kids who are living in their parents' houses or moving out for the first time. As a generation, they're even more economically screwed than the millennials were. So I can't even fault them for not subscribing to a minimalist lifestyle. Say what you want about the style, but cluttercore, in contrast to its maximalist roots, is definitely not a wealth flex. All of this to say, the past few years have created a perfect storm for maximalism to thrive. All of that time alone at home revealed the need and created the opportunity for people to intentionally craft their day-to-day lives. But here's where it all kind of went sideways. In an era where most of our lives are online, I'm not faulting anyone who craves a more material existence. If the sudden popularity of sourdough bread in 2020 taught us anything, it's that at least sometimes we crave reminders that we live in a physical world, not just a digital one. This revitalization of maximalism is unique because of the unique circumstances we were in. We wanted to create cozy homes, things that reminded us of our grandma's place, you know, with the weird, quirky old quilts or a vintage vase that you always kind of thought was weird looking. But we live in a post-industrial world where those kinds of weird things don't exist unless we have a grandma to borrow them from or a weird consignment shop where you can find it. For the most part, people are going to be filling that void in one way, through the internet. Who else is gonna sell you a weird knockoff of a vintage vase at any time? Or better yet, sell you this eclectic sculpture of a balloon poop dog? Listen, if someone made this weird thing in the 20s or the 70s, I'd be like, whoa, that is some crazy cool art shit right there. But in today's world, this is just another shitty piece of plastic that was made in some factory overseas. There's nothing artful or quality about it. This is what separates today's maximalism from those trends of the past, where things were handcrafted, intentionally made, difficult to acquire, and likely much more meaningful. Today, everything is made of plastic, ready for overnight shipping no matter where you are, and the people selling it to you are just a bunch of rich assholes doing anything to make a buck. And the story that these kinds of objects are saying is, we don't give a shit. E-commerce in general almost doubled between 2020 and 2022. Billionaires like Bezos and Musk added $1 trillion to their net worth, which is 12 zeros if you're counting. An Amazon search for maximalist decor pulls up furniture, things to put on top of your furniture, disco cowgirl art prints, a resin bulldog piggy bank storage tray, and hundreds of other random things that you definitely don't need. It's just random shit that looks interesting through the lens of a camera that's gonna get you to stop the doom scroll for maybe just one extra second. And this is another layer because maximalism today fits perfectly into our hyper-digital world. We're constantly overstimulated and seeking more and more visual engagement to hit up that dopamine feeling that we get from our phones. And this is what these things are trying to do, but in real life. Like, can you imagine today standing in the middle of Times Square and still needing to scroll on Instagram to get that feeling? I mean, I kind of can, but that experience would probably kill a medieval peasant instantly. If maximalism is meant to tell a story, we're in the version of the story where our life's meaning is sold to us overnight with free shipping. And this shift makes sense if you look at our other broader cultural trends. Fast fashion, unnecessary objects, overproduction, overconsumption. You know, what basically every single video that this channel publishes is about. So yeah, maximalism is just a trend that is going to come and go like all of the trends that came before it. But sadly, this one is going to leave a much bigger pile of trash in its wake. So listen, I don't know, moral of the story here, don't buy a bunch of crap that you don't need, and subscribe to our channel if you want to see more breakdowns on our consumer world. And thank you so much for being here. We recently broke 500,000 subscribers, which is kind of a crazy milestone. Thank you to everybody who is here and a part of it, and we'll see you next week for another episode.